Hi, I'm JT McGill,
I'm Matthew Canil.
I'm Dan Marshall.
And I'm Jesus Ferrand.
and this is our final project for EGR 305.
All right, here we have an overall view of the Gatling gun fully assembled. The primary groups are the tripod, the barrel assembly, the frame, and the rear assembly. You also have a magazine assembly inserted currently.
All right, and the whole purpose of this project really was to make something and explore the kinematics workbench. That was the really big one that we were trying to learn more about in this project. And so the project is fully kinematically animated. All of the barrels turn, the breech blocks move, and the strikers drop, which is really, really cool. So to start, let's just jump right into the sub-assemblies. The first subassembly is the breech block subassembly. This is the breech that slides back and forth in the breech carrier. This is what picks up, chambers the round, fires it, and then extracts it and kicks it out of the gun. So this is a pretty important part. And the most important part of it is the breech block. This is just what actually carries the cartridge. Most of the parts in this subassembly attach to this breech block, and it's fairly simple to make. I made it with parts, pads, and 2 holes. Nothing really challenging here. Next part is the striker. This is again mostly parts and pads. This is really just a piece of mass. It has a spring behind it and a firing pin, and this is what actually detonates the primer on the cartridges and makes it fire. This is completely housed within the striker block, so it's a fully contained system. Here we have the striker retention pin. This shoots through the hole in the side of the breech block and retains that striker block you just saw in the final assembly. I made it with the combine tool so I could get that radius profile on the outside edge so that it would be a smooth outside cylinder on the breech block, because again it has to reciprocate in a cylindrical track. This is the breech bolt. This inserts from the back of the breech block through a hole in the striker and screws into the pin that holds the striker in place, and this just kind of helps hold the entire assembly together. It also acts as a guide rod for the spring that actions the striker. And to do that better, it has a long, smooth shoulder up to the threading at the tip of the bolt. Next, we have the extractor. This sits in a recess cut into the side of the breech block and is held in with the interference fit pin. It pivots around this pin and has a spring that tensions it at the end. This is what grabs the edge of the case rim and helps extract it once the round has been fired. This is the pin that holds the extractor in place. It's fairly self-explanatory. It was just one pad, so it's a fairly simple part. And lastly, we have the springs. There are 2 springs in this assembly. One sits underneath a tab on the extractor and puts spring pressure on it so it can move around the rim of the cartridge without breaking or bending. It's a fairly small spring, and it's recessed completely within the breech block. The second one is the striker spring, and this is going to be a fairly large spring. Like I said earlier, it sits on the shoulder of the breech block bolt, and it is what actually forces the striker forward and puts the firing pin into the primer and detonates the cartridge, so it's a fairly important part.
Coming up next, we have the barrel subassembly, and it consists of 5 parts. This is a part that solely spins by the action of the crank. The first component of this subassembly is the barrel. There are 10 of these barrels that are in the subassembly. The main feature of this barrel was made by revolving a profile using the shaft command. The barrel is tapered, and it features rifling and a hexagonal cut at the end. The hexagonal cut was done by sketching a surface in the GSD workbench. And then, back in the part design workbench, the split command was used to make the cut by trimming the end of the barrel using the surface. The inside of the barrel is actually rifled. To accomplish this feature, I sketched a helix that would move along the inside of the barrel. I sketched a profile that I then slotted along the helix. To make the rifling smooth, the helix used a pulling direction, which was the axis of the barrel. There are 10 barrels that are held by 2 brass rings. This is the forward brass ring that we saw in the subassembly picture. It is pretty much self-explanatory, a revolved profile and then a series of 10 circular patterned holes. There's also a back brass ring which holds the barrels, and it also connects to the carrier block, which we're about to see next. Notice that the one of the faces of this ring has a different holes than the previous one. These holes allow the rims of the cartridge to fit such that they're flush with the face. They also have a rectangular cut that will allow the breech block extractor to fit into them. Notice also that the inner ring, if you will, has a lock. This allows the carrier block to be fixed with respect to the ring once you slide it in. Next we have the carrier block. This is also a pretty self-explanatory part. The breech blocks go into this part. The carrier block features a track that allows the breech block to slide along the holes without actually coming out of the breech block. The way this works is, the way the Gatling gun works is by dropping rounds into the forward end of the breech block, and then the carrier block would push them into the chambers that we saw in the last brass ring. Finally, we have the shaft, the main shaft. This is essentially a rod with a gear in the end. This rod goes through all the brass rings and the carrier block. What this does is it features a series of rectangular pads that allow the carrier block to be fixed with respect to the main shaft. The gear of the main shaft is driven by another gear that's on a crankshaft. These are bevel gears that are at 90 degrees with respect to one another, so that way the motion of the crank spins the barrels.
Alright, so next we're going to look at the frame assembly. This sub-assembly here has a lot of the structural components for the gun, and also has a few interesting parts related to the operating mechanism, so we'll see those in a little bit. Alright, so there's the frame. What this is kind of the backbone of the entire gun. At the front, you'll see the knob and front sight. That knob, the main shaft goes into there, so it supports the whole rotating structure. And then towards the rear, we have various bolt holes for connecting to the lower frame and to the back of the gun. And then there's also a large rectangular pocket. That's what allows the magazine and bullets to pass from the outside of the gun into the carrier block. The bottom frame is what connects the main frame and consequently the rest of the gun to the tripod. So this is usually placed about center mass of the gun because it's the pivot point. So that allows it to turn as easily as possible. Again, you see the bolt holes that would connect it to the main frame. What we have here is a protective shroud. This is a sheet metal part. I believe it's brass in this case. And what this does is it kind of covers the entire mechanism, protects it from dirt. You'll see later on there's a lot of tracks and raceways and parts that rub past each other that you wouldn't want dirt or dust or any kind of fouling getting into. So that's kind of the purpose of this part, is it protects the mechanism from outside contamination. All right, and here we have the rear subassembly. This has the back end of the gun and the camming slot, which is going to be particularly important. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So to start off with, all the way at the back, we have the handle. This handle, it's not part of the crank or anything. It's just sort of to support the gun. Move it as you're operating it, get a good firm grip on it. And this here's the handle guard. This holds the handle in place, and there's also what attaches to the back of the gun. And it's got a bit of a guard on the right side there, the big flap of metal to the right, just to protect the operator's hands. And moving just slightly more forward, we have the end cap. This protects the gears in between the crank and the main gear shaft that drives the carrier block and the rest of the gun. We have two bolt holes in the middle. Those are for attaching the handle assembly we saw just before. And at the top, there is a notch sight. This is the rear sight for the weapon. Also interesting, it's kind of hard to see, but in the bottom left image, you could see a cutout. What that allows is for this part to be slipped over the back of the gun and over the crank handle. So that's just a slot that was put in there. All right, and this is the gear plate. This is what holds the main gear shaft and the crank handle gear shaft in place. So that middle hole in the big circle is the one that the main shaft goes through, and that little cropped up part in the top right, you'll see that's what holds the crank handle gear in place. And moving on, this is what I personally consider the most interesting part of the gun for a few reasons. This is the cam ramp. So what this piece does is it guides the lugs on the carrier bolts and tells them when to move forward and back. So you'll see that there's actually two channels. There's This one here, this one down here. What this top one does is this moves the entire bolt forward and back. So this is where it allows it to move back in order for extraction and ejection. And then it moves forward again in order to chamber the round. And then this bottom track here is what holds the striker. So the striker's allowed to move with the gun for a time until it hits a point where it's almost all the way forward, and then it gets held back. And what that does is, while the rest of the bolt's moving forward and the striker's held back, that compresses the spring rather, in the breech block. Then, once it hits the shelf about midway through the bottom of travel, it's allowed to fly forward again. So that's what lets the striker fly forward, hit the round, detonate the primer, and set off the cartridge. And then again, it'll continue on, move back again, and that extracts the round. This was an interesting part to make. It took a lot of helices to get the up and down motion. There's a few rotational cuts for the striker drop. And later on, besides the geometry, a really interesting part was making the surfaces for the kinematic joints. So I took the surfaces kind of on the inside of the cuts, extracted them, moved them up so they were in the middle, and then aligned those with points on the carrier bolts that they would move appropriately. And we'll see a little animation of that later on.